So we've just hit 10,000 subscribers on the channel, and I wanted to say thank you all so much. And I wanted to celebrate today with a very special Q&A, Ask Me Anything show. I put out the call not too long ago for your bookish questions, and we got so many great questions in. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for watching along and reading along, and let's dive in to the first great question. Okay, let's start off with a great question from Caroline, who says, can you talk about what inspired you to start the HLBC, that's the Hardcore Literature Book Club? Do you feel daunted by recommending books and anxious that people will love them? I always do if I recommend a book to anyone. I promise they will love it. But when they actually get reading, I get the worries. What if they hate it? And do you have a 2023 schedule in mind? Great questions. Thank you so much, Caroline. What inspired me to start the HLBC? Well, I was doing the Hardcore Literature podcast for a little while, and I was getting a lot of people asking specifically for a book club. A lot of people were saying you should do a book club, a formal book club, and if you get people saying the same thing to you enough times, you start to think, maybe I should do a book club. But I kind of filed it away for a little bit, and then the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown. And even though my reading was already very deep pre-lockdown, it only deepened, and it became about as deep as it's ever been in my life. And I think a lot of people all over the world felt the same thing. Some people who don't read very much, they haven't read for many years, perhaps they haven't read since school, all of a sudden were returning to books or coming to great books for the first time. A lot of people during lockdown realised that there was a bit of a limit when it comes to frivolous and dispensable entertainment. And I think a lot of people wanted something more. We were suddenly faced with the prospect of having a very narrow range of where we could move, and I think we wanted to travel all over the world in our minds. We wanted to meet other people in our minds, and we suddenly had a lot of time on our hands. And a lot of us started to use that really wisely, and we went back to the great books and we filled our time with reading great literature. And a lot of people developed a little bit of an addiction, a passion, an obsession for great literature over the course of lockdown. And so I found myself wanting to share my passion with other people. This is one of the things about reading that I have always enjoyed. Of course, you've got the solitary aspect, you've got the introspection and the reflection and the spending time alone, which obviously appeals to me as quite a strong introvert. But at the same time, I always found that books were a gateway to other people. They allowed us to connect with other people on a really deep and meaningful level. And it was always the discussion after reading something or over the course of reading something that I derived great value out of. And another thing that we really love when it comes to broadening our horizons is having a guide. If you've ever been to an art gallery with somebody who knows the different paintings, this is Caravaggio and this one's important because of this reason and this reason, it takes your experience and your understanding and your appreciation to a whole new level. If we want to learn about a new musical genre, jazz, for example, can seem rather impenetrable or difficult to get into. We hope that we come across somebody, perhaps on the radio, who can walk us through the different ages and explain why they're important, contextualise the art that we find ourselves curious about, intrigued to discover more. And so the Hardcore Literature Book Club was born off of the back of a lot of people asking me to put one together for a little while, and compounded with the lockdowns. And we started off by reading Tolstoy, and then Dostoyevsky, and then Jane Austen, and Cervantes. And even though the book club still has very much an intimate sort of family vibe, a really nice, close atmosphere, it's gone from strength to strength each and every month, and more people are coming to the great books and deriving a lot of joy from a deep communal reading. So, in a nutshell, I'd had it on my mind for a while. A lot of people seemed to want a book club, and then over the course of lockdown, born out of my desire to connect with other people on a deep level, particularly at that time when we seemed rather disconnected, didn't we? We seemed rather cut off. I thought the books, surely, were an avenue to connection and meaning. And as we found out, that most certainly was the case. As for worrying when recommending a book to other people, I'm quite confident in my recommendations, but I also preface a lot of my recommendations with the caveat that the criteria or the thing that we're searching for isn't necessarily that you fall in love with the book. Yes, we want to put you in the position to experience books that you might fall in love with, but some of the books that, some readers absolutely adore, some of the writers that some readers adore, Victor Hugo, Jane Austen, they will always have a healthy handful of people who absolutely cannot abide them. And I think it is a wonderful feeling to fall in love with a work and to find yourself in simpatico with a writer, to develop a friendship across space and time, where you read a writer's work and you think, that's a piece of me right there. That's always a great feeling. But sometimes it's okay not to love a book. One of the criteria for a good book club pick is how inexhaustible the book is, and that doesn't necessarily mean we enjoy the reading experience. Many writers can actually offer us a very uncomfortable reading experience, and they can force us to look some really uncomfortable truths right in the face. Some reading experiences can be really unnerving. They can haunt us a little bit. So personally, I don't mind if a reader comes away from one of my book suggestions not having fallen in love with the experience or loved the experience, so long as they take something away in regards to a different key aspect of the human condition. And sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes we don't always love the deep work necessary to obtain that kind of wisdom. And I think whether one loves or hates a book, as long as they relish the experience, as long as it resonates with them or they remember it, I think that's good enough. And as for the 2023 schedule, yes, absolutely. I'm really excited to announce that. I'm keeping it a little bit hush-hush for the time being, but it's going to be really exciting. We've got some new goodies and we've got a few different special projects that I think you're going to be really excited about. So yes, 2023 is already planned out, mapped out, and it's going to be a terrific year. Thank you so much, Caroline. Now, let's go on to Casey, who asks, how would I go about finding original schedules for when a book came out serially? For example, I'm currently reading Ulysses, in which the first few chapters were published in magazines prior to the full novel. Great question, Casey. There is a stock phrase that you can pop into your favourite search engine and you can affix whatever novel or whatever work you're interested in. And the phrase is original serialised publication schedule. So if you pop that into a search engine, let's do it in real time. Ulysses original serialised publication schedule. We're told immediately, and we have a bunch of different websites that look really helpful, that on this day in 1922, Dublin writer James Joyce's Ulysses was published, first published in a serialised format in American journal The Little Review between March 1918 and December 1920. It was then published in its entirety in Paris, and it goes on. So you've been given a little breadcrumb, and the fun about following an original serialised publication schedule is going on that little hunt and amassing your materials, figuring out what the time schedule was like originally. And so we're told here that between March 1918 and December 1920 it was published, and we're given the actual journal. So if we whack that into a search engine, we just type in The Little Review, let's say March 1918 Ulysses, it pops right up. And then it's up to you how you want to portion that out, whether you want to find out how much of that was published and then map it out to your edition, or if you want to start going down the collecting route and trying to get original materials. I chanced across a collection of All the Year Round. That was Charles Dickens's magazine. Just the other day. I couldn't believe my luck. I opened it and there was, I think it was like chapter 20 or something, for Great Expectations, and it was all there on the shelf, it was all stacked up. This was at a restaurant, and I was so tempted to ask if I could take that off their hands. Could I offer them something for it? The thing is, I'm not even sure that somebody knows just how valuable that would be. Now, it wouldn't be a ton of money, probably not a ton of money, but sentimentally, that would be really valuable. So then it's up to you where you want to get your materials from, but I would say embrace the rabbit hunt. One of my favourite things to do with reading the great books or living the great books is making it a part of your life. Delaying your gratification, finding your materials, ordering them, having to wait a certain time feverishly, and then when it turns up, tearing the package off and tearing through the work or your allotted amount. Make a ritual about this and embrace the search, enjoy the search, but that's a good place to get started. And if that fails, because the internet doesn't actually know everything, and those of us born before the rise of the internet know the value in forming a personal relationship with your librarian. Librarians are magical people, and good ones do know a lot about books, a lot more than you might find on the internet. So that's where I would start. I would start by Googling original serialised publication schedule. If you do that for Ulysses, if you do that for Middlemarch, if you do that for Turn of the Screw, there's loads of great expectations. Very often you'll come face to face with some of my content, and we'll do some more of that in the future, of course, because as you know, that's one of my favourite things. It's one of my favourite things to do, is to pace out my reading following the original schedule. So, thank you, Casey. Wonderful question. Let's go on to another. Okay, next question. You're so close. Thank you. You're going to get there, Ben. Keep up the good work. As for the question, have you ever tried your hand at writing? Fiction specifically. Bonus question. If you could read only one book for the rest of your life, what would it be? Have I tried my hand at writing fiction? Yes, extensively. I think it's an extension of our appreciation. And I've been writing stories, little short stories, poetry, full-length novels, articles, everything really, plays, screenplays, for years, ever since I was as a child, really. And I think the first piece of fiction I wrote was off the back of reading Tolkien, and I wrote my own story that kind of existed in his world. For many years, part of my daily routine involved a lot of writing. 2 to 4 hours in the morning, minimum, and I would try different techniques, I would try different exercises, and I would mix it up, mainly for my own joy and my own benefit. And I think a lot of people who fall in love with literature, that love at some point will find an outlet in your own self-expression. So of course you read your favourite authors, and the highest compliment you end up paying to them is imitating them in your own prose or poetry, whatever you're into. So yes, absolutely. As for one book, if I could read just one book, that would be the complete works of Shakespeare. 100%, the complete works of Shakespeare, and I would be very happy with that. That's the desert island question, isn't it? If you could just bring just one book to a desert island. For me, it would be Shakespeare. What would it be for you? Let's go on to the next question. Thank you so much for a great question. Okay, next question is from Eleanor, who says, thank you for all of your work. It has been such a wonderful refuge for me over the last few years. Oh, thank you so much. My question, is there any great book or author in particular you have absolutely no interest in studying? That's an interesting question, and it's interesting because I've noticed there's been a few questions that are kind of similar. People seem to be interested in the authors that I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. I think there isn't anybody who comes immediately to mind. If I haven't yet spoken about a certain author or book, it's not necessarily because I haven't read it or enjoyed it or respect it, but I'm pressing up against that age-old realisation of too many books, too little time. My time's absolutely full with the books we're addressing right now, and a day doesn't go by without me wishing I could duplicate myself or freeze time for a little bit so that I could get more books in. We have so many different works that I'm so keen to discuss. Is there anybody I wouldn't want to discuss? Probably not, to be honest. I love everything. I really do. Non-fiction, fiction, contemporary, classic. I love all mediums. So no, I can't think of any. Next question is from Joseph, who asks, if you could read any book again for the first time, what would it be? For me, it would either be Monte Cristo or A Wizard of Earthsea. Well, Joseph, it's interesting that you mentioned those two because I dug both of them out of the closet just the other day. I rifled through Ursula K. Le Guin's wonderful, magical world just the other day, and it really brought back some memories of childhood. Of course, Monte Cristo is fabulous. I'm planning some content on that. For me, if we can count the complete works of Shakespeare, it probably sounds like a cop-out because I've just said that would be the book. But the thing is, when you come to Shakespeare for the first time, you are always ill-prepared, you're always ill-equipped. And it's only after a lot of reading, extensive reading after many years, that you can really start to get some nourishment and sustenance. When you first come to him, and when I first came to him I was a child, of course I didn't understand what I was reading. All I understood was I liked it and it felt quite magical. If I could possibly read his works for the first time but have the knowledge that I have now, I would love to see what that would be like. I think it would be an overwhelming experience. So for me it's Shakespeare, but Ursula K. Le Guin and Alexander Dumas are very, very fine choices too. Great stories, both of them. And our next question. Congratulations, Ben. Thank you very much. As a young fellow who's very glad to have found your channel a while ago and going to university this year, would it be wise for me to start tackling your 3 to 5 year reading list from your website at this busy time of my life? Any tips on making time for reading without rushing? It would be greatly appreciated. All the best. Great question, and a nice one on going to university. So the 3 to 5 year reading list, which is based on a reading list in Adler's How to Read a Book, which I believe itself was based on St. John's College, their humanities syllabus. Personally, I think breach the books that get you most excited and follow the plan that gets you the most excited, the schedule that gets you the most excited. And if you're excited by that schedule, the thing is, we see these schedules, don't we? And this is what's happened with the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We have a huge back catalogue of these, discussions and lectures on the great books. People want to experience it all at once. They want to have read it all at once. And I'm exactly the same. My room is right now littered with books, and I find it difficult to sit with just one book. I tear through many simultaneously because I want to get through so many. But it's important to remind ourselves now and then to slow down. What is our intention? What are we trying to get out of what we're doing in the present moment? And is the thing before us helping us with that aim? So, in our case, we're talking about books. Is the book that has been carefully curated so as to broaden your horizons, is that a good choice of book for you? And if the answer is yes, then bring all your powers of attention and concentration and presence and stillness to that moment to get as much out of that book and to do that book the best service in that present moment. So we need to pick our books very wisely. Of course, I'm no stranger to this whole too many books, too little time thing. For me, it announces itself most emphatically when it comes to podcasts. I have so many books I want to talk about on the podcast, but there's only a certain amount of time in the day. So we have to pick very, very wisely. I would say that the 3 to 5 year reading list, that's based on a chronological approach where you go through the great books of the Western tradition and march your way forward up until more contemporary times. And that way, each book that comes next, you get more of an understanding of the tradition that it arose out of. You can see the different influences and stuff. Personally, I would recommend the schedule for the Hardcore Literature Book Club, especially if you're busy. Now, the thing with the book club schedule and the surrounding lectures is it's all built around self-pacing. So if you have the luxury of time, you can put more time into it, but it's also built off the back of hardcore curation. So there are many professionals in some really challenging industries in the book club who don't have all the time in the world. We're talking about doctors and engineers and students like yourself too. So the curation, that's really, really important. I think personally, if you're trying to get through a lot of books, then most people, even students, can read a book a week. Whether you should or not is another matter, and of course that's rather ambiguous because what book are we talking about here? Can you read Anna Karenina in a week? Maybe with a full-time schedule, I'm not convinced, and if you can manage to do that, then you're the exception, not the rule. You have a very fast pace, you might even have a photographic memory. Maybe you're skimming, maybe you don't remember it. Personally, I think a deep read for a book that's worth it should take place over a couple of months. So when it comes to reading a book a week, I'm all for it for slimmer books. I'm all for it for those books we might call secondary material, the books that help explicate, that help us understand the main books that we're reading. For the main books, as far as I'm concerned, if you're working at a fast pace, I would say pick a very, very good book and do a book a month. Yes, you can go longer than that. I often recommend going longer than that. I recommend building in time to journal. I recommend rereading, baking your rereading in as you go along, but also doing it again when you get to the end. But a book a month is doable with the great books. And you want to make sure that if you've got a really great book in front of you, I'm thinking Plato's Republic, do your thinking on the page. Now that means that you might only have time to read a couple of pages each day. If you're a student with an overwhelming workload or a busy working professional, I'm a huge fan of planning out your week at the beginning of the week. I'm a huge fan of this measure twice, cut once approach. I like to take a Sunday afternoon and I like to dedicate at least 30 minutes to just fleshing out a loose structure of what I want to get done that week. And what I'll typically do is I will schedule exercise, my physical athletic exercise regime. I'll schedule that and my reading first and foremost, and then I'll scaffold everything else around it. So I'll pre-plan and I'll think about where I can allocate blocks of time to reading specifically and working out, running and that sort of thing. And the reason I do those two things first is because these are two of the most important things and everything else trickles down from there. If you're healthy, if you can breathe, and if you're not racked with pain, and if you can think smoothly, then everything else will be much easier. And the thing is, sometimes if we don't plan, it doesn't get done. And this is the same with reading as well. We say, we'll read at the end of the day, but the end of the day comes and you've had a challenging day and maybe you're a bit too tired and you can't really read as well as you may have liked. Sometimes you need a little bit of forethought and planning, and you might think, hey, Tuesday and Wednesday this week are going to be brutal, but I want to get my reading in. So the thing I need to do is set my alarm 30 minutes early, make a coffee, and read before the day kicks off. So make your planner your friend, whether you have a digital planner or a physical copy. I use both kinds in sync with each other. We can talk about that at some point if you're interested. Befriend your planner and portion out what you think you can get done. And that might look like a daily habit of 15 to 20 minutes reading during the week. It might look like an hour on one of the weekend days, but a little bit of planning will definitely help you there. Okay, next question. We have a great one from Mahmoud, who says, wonderful news, Ben. Well deserved. Thank you very much, my friend. Question. When seeking to read through an author's entire oeuvre, what guides your selection of the reading order? Chronological, best works first, most accessible works first, etc.? This is a really great question. And of course, there are so many different factors and variables that will influence what choice is right for you. I think if you're working your way through a single author's canon, which is something that I love to do, that and reading in the original serialized publication schedule following that, those are my two favourite things to do when it comes to living the great books. For me, the decision is always made when you have first read their canonical work, their magnum opus, their masterpiece, the work that they're best known for. So for Herman Melville, that would be Moby Dick. For Jack Kerouac, that would be On the Road. And of course, you would argue, potentially, that they might have another book that has been underserved, or maybe that work shouldn't be the canonical one. That's definitely part of the fun when you begin to breach through their canon and march your way through it. I like to read that magnum opus first, and then go all the way back to the beginning and see where they began. So for Melville, you'd go all the way back to Typee, and then Omu, and then Mardi, and you would read White Jacket and Redburn, and then you'd read Moby Dick, his 5th novel. And of course, have a little look and see, are there short stories, are there poems, when were they written, are there any articles? And I think that's a really rewarding thing to do. So read their masterpiece first, or read one of the books that they're most renowned for, and if you find yourself really struck with what they're doing there, then you will gain an incredible appreciation for an author who's quickly become your favourite by marking their aesthetic development. I've done this with Shakespeare. Of course, I first read his masterpieces, King Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, or we might not call Romeo and Juliet one of his best, but it marks his moving into a more mature phase. A Midsummer Night's Dream, potentially his first masterpiece. The Henriade. You read all the great ones first, and then if you really love Shakespeare, and if you've read him with all of yourself and you've brought as much as you can to him, then you will love him. Then you sketch out a chronology. And there's some debate in the margins when he wrote different plays. Who was involved? Did he write all of this play, or was it a collaboration with another author? Was it a collaboration with the whole theatre troupe? That's part of the fun of it as well. But as best as you can, you find that first work and you make your way through. And with Shakespeare, you start to think, wow, he wasn't good when he started. But that's a really liberating thing to notice, and it's really exciting. And you start to think, well, of course he wasn't good. He was young, he was just getting his footing in the theatrical world and the literary world, and he was also thinking. You can see he's thinking, and he's making moves, small moves towards some really incredible things. The really exciting thing is about Shakespeare is before him, of course, we had grand personages, we had wonderful characters, but they didn't change that much and we didn't really see them thinking. And so when you're reading Shakespeare, for example, chronologically, you start to see little areas in which his characters first start to think and debate and have this inner turmoil. And with each passing play, read chronologically, you see it develop even more. And of course he develops in other areas too. You can see him have his tragic period. Well, what came before that tragic period? And then you start to think, well, something must have happened. And you try to discern from the works before you what that something was. And so you observe that very early on he had a good handle, a good mastery on the comedies, and pretty good handle on the histories too. But it was tragedy that he struggled with. And then once you've got through his tragic phase, you see his romance phase, and a full understanding of his later, more mature works, his romances. Really, a full understanding can't really be had unless you've done the chronological reading at a certain level. So it's really deep cuts. This is something that I've done with Cormac McCarthy as well, and you see the same thing as well. And I'm even doing that for more mainstream pop culture writers. I like the mythology and the lore around Stephen King, the lore of being a writer. And so I'm making my way chronologically through his works, and I must say, I wasn't a fan of Carrie, though the idea was wonderful. The imagination on King was wonderful. And again with Salem's Lot, you start to think, hang on a minute, because when you come to The Shining and you realise how wonderful the pace is and the characterisation has taken a huge leap forward, you see those first 2 books as his experimentation ground. And watching a writer's development is one of the most exciting things. And I can't think of an exercise, a reading exercise that you could do that would better help you get into a writer fully. So I'm definitely a huge fan of the chronological work once you've read their main work. And if you absolutely love it, if there's something inside you that really resonates with that writer, then you will give them the special treatment. And I think a good reading program can be broken into 2 main parts. There's other parts as well, but first and foremost, your reading program should take you through the great books. So you're marching through Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky and Austen and many more great writers. But then you have this other branch where as you make your way through those great books, you will bump into writers who you love more than other writers. Those writers you put your arms around them, and you go, okay, whilst I'm continuing to march through the great books, I've now met a writer who I absolutely love, and that's your special author. And there begins a whole new exciting journey where you learn all about them. And then once you make your way through one author in that fashion, and you're continuing to work through the great books, by that time you have undoubtedly come up against another writer you love, and you might decide to do it all over again. So I think this is a really good way to become extremely well read in a T shape, going wide and deep, and it's a really rewarding thing to do. So let us know which author you're interested in doing this with. I'd be very curious to know, and thank you for the great question. Okay, next question. When and how has your love for reading literature started to develop? I spoke about this at quite a bit of length on the latest podcast, Reflections on the Great Books, on my birthday, but to put it in a nutshell, I wasn't a massive reader as a child. In fact, I was really averse to reading. And there were three primary influences. There was my grandmother, who got me into Shakespeare, got me into Dickens, got me into poetry, because she would talk about her favourite plays and the theatre and reading books as a little girl in Dublin and going to the Saturday matinees and all of that. And then there was my father, who took me to plays, David Mamet plays, Shakespeare plays and so forth. And then I was lucky to have a handful of really great English teachers who all inspired me to different degrees. One in particular really wrapped his tendrils of influence around me. He helped me understand Dickens, he helped me understand Shakespeare, and he influenced my dissertation choice. When I went on to Oxford, I wrote on Joseph Conrad, and I read everything that Conrad put out, and that was born out of my teacher's love of Heart of Darkness. I asked him what his favourite novel was, and he told me it was that, and I went home and read it in a single sitting. So it was over the course of my teenage years. I got into reading in a big way. I was quite introverted, and so it was a way of escaping from other people, but also simultaneously connecting with other people. And sometimes if you don't feel yourself to be fitting in with others, you don't feel that you're particularly interested in what most people are talking about, you often, at a formative age, you find solace in great literature and companionship and comfort. And that's how I got into it. Great question, thank you. And we have not a question, but a nice message. I wish you to greater successes in the future, and hopefully for the millionth. You deserve the best for your wonderful book channel. Thank you so much, I really appreciate that. Next question. I'm finding a lot of modernistic, post-modernistic novels, especially those who are jumping everywhere, hard to imagine, very boring. So because I'm thinking that maybe I missed something, I want to ask you if you have any tips on how to read them, or maybe where to start with them. Wonderful question. So, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Understanding postmodernism, and indeed modernism, requires one to have knowledge of where we came from. In much the same way that the later half of the 20th century was, artistically, I see it, as being a response to what Joyce was doing, and, in a way, a response to what Proust was doing. The early 20th century was a response to 19th century literature and what they were doing. And around the turn of the century, you can see writers who straddle both traditions, who have written great works in the 19th and the 20th century. You can see a tension as they try to work out how to stride boldly forward. At the turn of the century, there was this anxiety about art and how one might reform art, especially with the explosion of new artistic mediums. We can see this with painting, and when the photography came in and when film came in, suddenly painting had to do something that those mediums potentially couldn't do. So it didn't matter whether a painting was faithful to what it professed to be representing or not. It had to do some other things, and that's where we get some of the avant-garde from. That's where we get surrealism, Dadaism, cubism and all of that. And this is true in any artistic medium, and most certainly when it comes to the novel. You can see modern writers and postmodern writers really rather desperately needing to shake things up and simultaneously carry on the tradition that came before, that inspired them to pick up the pen, but also to swerve away from that tradition and make their mark on the history of literature themselves. So, I have a couple of recommendations. First and foremost, start reading more late 19th century fiction and see what they were doing. What was the norm around that time? Read fiction that was coming out around the turn of the century and see how that was starting to differ from the 19th century fiction. If you read enough, you'll start to see patterns and commonalities and themes that transcend authors. Two different authors could have never read one another, never met, but they seem to be influenced by one another by virtue of the fact that they're picking up on something in the culture or in the epoch. So that's really, really important. Another thing to do is if you have a really difficult book in front of you, James Joyce's Ulysses, let's not even get started about Finnegan's Wake, Thomas Pynchon, for example, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Cormac McCarthy can be a bit difficult. I think his Blood Meridian is stylistically and emotionally difficult. Toni Morrison can be a bit difficult. A good thing to do is to find out if they have a more accessible work. Very often they do. Very often it's shorter, it's easier to understand, and not only that, but it's something of a prerequisite to fully getting as much as you can out of the difficult work. So with James Joyce, if Ulysses is stumping you, as it has done many readers before you, go back to his portrait of the artist as a young man. If you're trying to get through Gravity's Rainbow, read The Crying of Lot 49 first. It's slimmer, it's easier, there's less to tackle, so you can put a lot more care and time and intention, and you can get through it quicker, and you can bake your rereading into it. And this is most certainly true for any writer who has played around extensively with consciousness. Now, another recommendation would be to embrace guides, guided reading tours, guided reading experiences, lectures, talks, whatever you want to call them. Listen to lectures, listen to podcasts, watch videos, look at articles, pick up books that will help you through the work. If we're talking about Ulysses, the first book that comes to mind is a book by Stuart Gilbert, who put together a brilliant guide for getting through Ulysses. Gilbert had personal contact with Joyce himself, and Joyce gave his own nod of approval. He said that the guide was good. This is my copy of that. I bought that absolutely ages ago for next to nothing at a second-hand bookstore. Second-hand bookstores are most certainly your friends. You'll find works of criticism that help explicate the works that you're struggling with. And of course there's the Hardcore Literature Book Club. At time of recording, we are preparing for our first History of Literature lecture, which is about postmodernism and modernism. We're also breaching Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. We're also talking about Ulysses by James Joyce and Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and many more. So we would be very happy to have you there reading along and 100% being in the company of other people who are talking about books and also trying to further their own understanding and appreciation. That will have a very strong and significant knock-on effect for you, a really positive one. There's great value in just simply talking about books or reading about books or listening to people talk about books like you're doing right now as I'm talking. If, for example, you wanted to learn about chocolate making, sweet making, if you spent time around 3 or 4 of the best chocolatiers, if you spent time with people who owned the most successful sweet shops and knew everything about all the different sweets and how to make them super tasty, then wouldn't you, whether you like it or not, be an expert on sweets and chocolate after a little bit of time spent hanging out with them? And that's the same with books. If you want to understand books, talk about them and listen to others talk about them too. We very often don't know what we think about something until we write about it or talk about it. And sometimes the best way to understand these difficult texts is to spend time deliberately doing the difficult work and asking questions, pinpointing where the difficulty is and going on a little bit of a mission to answer questions. And talking about answering questions, thank you very much for your question. It was a great one. And let's move on to another one. Okay, let's go on to the next question. You mentioned you believed in l'art pour l'art, and excuse my awful French accent, and you also like Nietzsche, despite your faith. How do you solve some of those contradictions? I'll answer this one first because you have another question here. Potentially the biggest leap forward in my thinking was coming to terms with and coming to peace with contradictions, because I noticed that life is full of contradictions, and two seemingly completely contrary, two completely opposite things can both be true simultaneously, and that boggled my mind for a very long time, and it stands in the way of progressing. In regards to consciousness. So the first thing is, I think contradictions are necessary and they're a fact of life, but at the same time, I'm not fully art for art's sake. I'm not fully art has social utility, but I'm in the sort of between those two areas. I put a lot of stock in both of them. So I wouldn't say that I'm art for art's sake. I think I've probably said somewhere along the line that I was, but I'm not sure how accurate that would be, given what we're doing with the lectures and podcasts and the great amount of positive knock-on effects that people are getting from the discussions. So it's probably not art for art's sake. As for Nietzsche, I think this philosopher must be the philosopher who's been taken most out of context. Particularly we think Nietzsche and we think God is dead, but I think that's maxim or that resonant quote has become a soundbite, and I think we soundbite Nietzsche, and indeed any great philosopher. I could say the same for Plato too. We soundbite the philosophers at our peril. I personally read Nietzsche as a relentlessly positive philosopher. I get a lot of meaning out of Nietzsche, and so I don't think for people who have faith, I don't think they're precluded from reading Nietzsche or deriving nourishment from Nietzsche in particular by any means. But at the same time, perhaps we need to have a discussion at some point about what we mean when we say faith, because at a certain level, it all comes down to semantics. It all comes down to the words we use. Very often, a lot of these words fail to signify, even art for art's sake fails to signify. These are really huge, all-encompassing abstract ideas. We could talk about them quite endlessly and always get some new nuance out of them. So I'm not sure how thoroughly that answered your question, but you've also asked, have you read 100 Years of Solitude and did you like it? I tried to teach myself Spanish a very, very long time ago, and for some crazy reason I decided that was the book that I was going to use to do so. So I have kind of read it. Unfortunately, I couldn't really talk about it. I've forgotten most of it, and it is in dire need of a reread. I do remember enjoying it. Of course, I had the English version beside me, but I definitely need to reread that one. And also, thank you so much for your recommendations of great writers. I really appreciate that. Thank you for watching all the way over in Germany. Not a question, but Florian popping in to say, hiya Benjamin, and I'm looking forward to this upcoming Q&A. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching and supporting Florian. Next question from Nicholas. First of all, massive respect for you and your content. I absolutely love your videos and always enjoy watching them, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, I really appreciate that. My questions would be, 1. If there was a single author whom you had to pinpoint as your favourite of all time, who would it be? William Shakespeare. Do you like Tolkien? And if yes, what have you read of his? I love Tolkien. I'm currently rereading his Lord of the Rings in a hardback illustrated version, and it's good fun. Tolkien was one of the authors that kind of got me into reading at a very early age. I went on to read a lot of his stuff. I've got his Beowulf translation as well, and I also studied in the lecture hall or the classroom that he taught in at Oxford, which is pretty cool. So yes, I'm a big fan of Tolkien. And your third question, which country's literature do you most enjoy? Which country's literature do you want to read more of in the future? Loads of love. That's a great question. I would say the literature that I'm personally most comfortable with is English, because of course it's my mother tongue, so I can discern a lot more nuance from English. But I've always loved a lot of literature that I've had to read in translation. I've always been beholden to different translations. Russian literature, of course, you have so many different translators to choose from. In recent years, I've fallen in love with Pevere and Volokhonsky, the translator couple team. Their Anna Karenina's great, but then Rosamund Bartlett did a great one as well. I don't mind the Constance Garnett, and of course there are many more. Russian literature is wonderful, German literature is wonderful, and I need to read more of it. Italian literature, I need to read more of that. French literature, of course, I've always loved French literature. I do try to read it in the original, but I'm not fluent by any means, as is very obvious, but I'm a big fan of French literature. I love Japanese literature. I've been recently exploring more Indian literature and Chinese literature. Latin American literature has plenty to offer. Of course, one is always going to leave out a great country and its literary tradition. So I think, probably English is where I get a lot of my enjoyment from. English, French, Russian. For the future, I think I would like to read more Chinese and Indian literature, which requires a different framework, different paradigms of thought, and somewhat of a different approach to how one who's born in the West might approach the Western canon. But wonderful questions, Nicholas, and thank you so much. And Michelle has popped in to say, congratulations, you're going to hit 10k with no problem. We all greatly appreciate the amazing channel and HLBC that you created and all the time and effort you put into it. Wishing you continued success and enjoyment with it. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, and your support means so much to me. So thank you, I really appreciate that. Next question from Asil. Congrats in advance, mate. Thank you, mate. Well deserved. Your insights, coupled with your educational background, have been of tremendous value to me personally. As a non-English speaker, and coming from an Arabic, Islamic background, I find it difficult sometimes to read and gain knowledge, or rather appreciate, some of the great books you recommend. For example, though I did enjoy the moral anguish in Crime and Punishment, there were a lot of biblical references that were wasted on me. My question is, how much does one, with my background, traverse such literature to gain the most out of it? I ask this because you have sold me on Don Quixote and I really want to read it. Oh, nice. Yeah, Dostoyevsky definitely, I would say, requires a bit of a biblical background or knowledge in some of the works of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, which obviously coming from an Islamic background, we do have a shared tradition or a shared heritage. Many of the figures, the personages detailed in the Old Testament, or what Christians might call the Old Testament, are there in the Quran, but of course the stories are a little bit different. So I would think that you're probably more comfortable and familiar with Old Testament stories. As for Dostoyevsky, however, breaching the New Testament would be a very good idea. I think that the best approach for that would be to follow that sort of biblical rabbit hole when you see an allusion crop up. When you do find an allusion, go find the source where it is quoted from. We're doing that with Moby Dick, and that's quite easy to do because Melville will very deliberately signpost the books that he wants us to read, really quite overtly. Dostoyevsky kind of as well, but it requires a bit of a guided approach. And so in that way, lectures are really important and really valuable. Guided reading experiences are important. Having somebody to point out the different allusions is important. I myself have recently started getting a more deeper acquaintance, or trying to get a more deeper acquaintance with the Quran, and I'm following an approach that I took for the Bible as well, although it's a little bit different because I grew up in a Roman Catholic English culture, so the Bible's just all around. You're kind of immersed in it from the moment you're born. But the approach that I'm taking with the Quran is to read a little bit each day and just portion out a little bit of time where you explore or you read around what you're reading. And so that might look like a page, but then most of your reading time is trying to learn about what's on that page. And I think that's good for the Bible too. You might want to figure out what the most influential books of the Bible are. I would say Genesis, Job, Jonah is a big one for Moby Dick in particular. With Dostoyevsky, obviously it's New Testament wisdom. You might determine that the Sermon on the Mount in particular is an area that you should focus on. It's kind of a microcosm for all of the wisdom or all of the sayings of Jesus in particular. And you can make a list so it becomes a little bit less daunting. And then with that list, you've got a little bit of a program for self-scholarship, a little bit of a guide, and make your way through it, taking the same long-term approach, the same scholarly approach that you do with the great books, and by the end of the year, your knowledge of the Bible will expand in much the same way that by the end of a year where you've been reading Shakespeare throughout the year, your knowledge of Shakespeare will expand. Taking a long-term approach is so important for everything, not just reading. There's that saying, isn't there, where we overestimate what we can do in a year but underestimate what we can do in 3 or 5 years. And so a long-term approach is really rewarding, because you look back after a couple of years and you're a completely different person, and you've got all of this esoteric knowledge, you've got knowledge from all the different world traditions. So that's my recommendation. Take a long-term approach, have a little bit of planning, and enjoy the ride. Enjoy what you are learning, because actually being of a mature age and coming to some really foundational texts for the first time with fresh eyes is such a gift, and it's something that I would most certainly envy. Okay, next question is from Elizabeth, who says, Benjamin, I cannot express how much I enjoy your little pieces of sanity in this unstable world. Well, I really appreciate that. That's one of the nicest compliments I could have received. I am curious what other genres of literature you spend your time with, and is there a genre that you absolutely will not read? I hope for many blessings for you and yours. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I really appreciate that. Is there a genre I wouldn't read? To be honest, no. I would read absolutely everything. Like, absolutely everything. If you took my books away, I would find something to read. What do I spend my time doing? In the last couple of days, I've been reading trashy mainstream pop culture fiction, horror fiction most particularly. I have been reading philosophy. I've been reading tons of Plato. I have been reading play scripts, which are really interesting. I've been rereading Cormac McCarthy extensively. I'm really excited for his 2 novels, which are coming out later this year. I've been reading a lot of Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens really makes me think in a way that the only writers who are comparable to that level of thought prompted are philosophers, and his poetry is absolutely splendid. If you want a place to start with Wallace Stevens, then the Auroras of Autumn are really good. I've recently been rereading Walt Whitman, and I've been rereading basically all of my favourite poets. So there's a really good mix there, and definitely no 2 days look too alike, apart from the fact that there's always the great books running through the reading structure. And thank you very much for the great question, Elizabeth. Next question from Alex. Do you believe future writers need to stay informed about the trends of fiction in order to be successful? Personally, no. And this viewpoint might change, but I think you are best served reading those works that have endured, reading the classics, understanding where we come from, and then spending your time connecting with your own voice and connecting with your own themes and preoccupations, your own sentiments, and just spending a lot of time writing. So reading the great books and writing. Yeah, you probably do want to read the contemporary things, but I'm a huge believer in not keeping your eye on trends, and that's the difficulty when it comes to discerning which contemporary books are going to last. We're unfortunately too close to these books. Trends. You think if you're going to indulge a trend or something that's fashionable, it might not endure, and it might read like a really dated period piece in years to come. So I would say focus on that which endures, that's the human spirit, and play around with your unique voice, and don't worry about what the so-called competition are mucking about with, because you don't want to sound all the same, do you? When you pick up, I'm not going to say the name of the literary periodical that I receive 4 times a year, but all of the writers, they kind of sound the same. They kind of sound like they've been reading each other a little bit too much. So no, I don't think it's a prerequisite for being successful at all. But hey, my opinion on that might change. Thank you for the great question. We have a lovely comment from Shiva, who says, gratitude is a must for your exceptional works amidst the pool of rubbish contents in the booktube world. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. We have another question. Are there literary theories that you find particularly useful or meaningful? Is there a non-classic book that you find yourself returning to again and again? I really like Harold Bloom's theory of influence, not because I put stock in it entirely, but because I put stock in the idea that having a framework is more important than what the framework is. And you can pick any, go-to framework that critics like. You know, you could look at psychoanalytical readings, for example. It's the framework itself, it's the having a framework, and then if you have a framework, then you have something to deviate from. So it's a good way to have a lens through which to see the works, and that can be really rewarding rather than doing a sort of scattershot approach. But Harold Bloom's theory of influence it's not my prime way of reading, it's not what I get out of the great books, but having that as a framework is a really good focusing agent. If you'd like to learn more about that, then we had a podcast recently on that book. It's a difficult one, but I think it's worth checking out. We had a couple of book club members recently ask about Roland Barthes' Death of the Author and Carl Jung's writings on, you know, things like the anima and the animus, syzygy, that sort of thing, archetypes. I put a lot of stock into some of Jung's concepts and some of Freud's. Just some, and that's important to say. As for Barthes, I think the death of the author, that's a concept that you should understand, and we spoke at quite a lot of length in the monthly Q&A show in which the questions were put to me, but having an understanding of the concepts, understanding how people are reading the books, is potentially more important than subscribing to any one concept yourself. And is there any non-classic book that I find myself returning to? I've been reading Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi for years. It's always on my bedside. I always dip into it if that counts. Next question. Hey Ben, I'm a new subscriber. So it seems like your strong suit is literature. But are there any classic, historical, non-fiction books you've enjoyed? There's a lot to sift through, given you can't judge simply on the prose or creativity of the writer, but rather historical accuracy and narratives being pushed, etc. So far, I've found The Control of Oil by John Blair and Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson series and Power Broker to be excellent reads. Cheers and thanks for the content. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching. Interesting. Okay, you mentioned Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson series. I enjoyed Edmund Morris's The Rise of Roosevelt not too long ago. I like Stacy Schiff. If you're interested in the Salem witch hunts and all of that, then she has a really good book. She also has a great book on Cleopatra. I like Lucy Wolseley, which is kind of tied into a literary appreciation. She's got books on Jane Austen and the era of Jane Austen and Dickens and that sort of thing. I like Peter Ackroyd. He's got a great series. If you're interested in learning about the kings and queens of Britain, then Peter Ackroyd is great. James Shapiro is good. If you'd like to understand the Elizabethan Jacobean era and how that time exerted its influence upon Shakespeare, for example, then James Shapiro has some great books. I can show you what's on my bedside at the moment. Okay, I'm really getting into an author called D. Brown. I've got a book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and The American West, both really, really interesting, beautifully written, packed with information that's super accessible. And I have a book that was recommended by a book club member. This one's Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea. This is the story that inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It's really interesting and it's worth reading if you want some historical contextualization around Moby Dick. I recently picked up Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I've gone through it before, but I thought recently I'm going to go through it again a bit more deeply because I'm quite interested with the subject matter. Those are just a few that I'm enjoying. I also have A Nation Without Borders, which I haven't gotten into just yet, but looks like a good one. Personally, I'm a big fan of biographies. I think biography is much more important, more resonant, and much more telling than history. So whatever writer you're enjoying, try and seek out whether there is a good biography of them. Peter Ackroyd has one on Shakespeare. Edmund White has one on Proust, which looks like this. I recently read a great biography on Emily Bronte. All of these books not only bring what the writer's doing into focus, but you understand the time in which they were writing. Graham Robb, actually, now that I come to think of it, he's got one on Victor Hugo. He's also got one on Arthur Rimbaud. This is him on Hugo. Indispensable reading for anybody who wants to understand France at that time. And thank you very much for the great question. And the next question is from Jeff, who says, "You're an inspiration." Thank you. If there could be a specific topic you'd want to deep dive into, like get and read all you can of it, what would it be? Jazz. I'd like to learn a lot about jazz. I really enjoy listening to jazz, which a lot of you have picked up on. So probably, jazz. In my final year at university, my dissertation was on the Beat Generation. I was fascinated with post-war and Cold War American literature, but I'm quite happy just continuing to deepen my knowledge and appreciation of Shakespeare, for example. Wonderful question, and thank you so much. And the next question is from Hassan, who says, "Hey Ben, congrats on nearly getting to 10k. Your videos have been extremely motivating for me to get back into reading literature. My question is whether you think graphic novels, manga or comic books could be considered literature to the same standard as other great works of literary fiction. It's my opinion that works by authors such as Gaiman, Miura, Moore, etc. provide just as great an outlook into the many facets of the human condition as many of the great literary works of the past, and have enough depth to withstand countless deep rereads. Thank you so much for your effort in this channel." Thank you for the great question. I'm a huge fan of comic books. I don't know if anybody knows this. I think I've mentioned it a few times. When I was living in Japan, I was massively addicted to manga, and I used it to learn how to read Japanese, and that's a great way to learn a new language, through comic books. I'm always picking up random comic books. I do like to pop into a comic book store whenever I find one. Got a couple of random floppies, some old ones here. Was this Sergeant Rock. We also have DC's Weird Western Tales, The Scalp Hunter. We also have Werewolf by Night, a couple of these Werewolves by Night. Got DC's The Losers. I love flicking through these. I love some of the old adverts you get in these comic books. It's really cool stuff. I've recently been reading through the Silver Age of Marvel Comics, like 1962, 1963 onwards. The first issue of the Fantastic Four. Who else do we have? We have first Spider-Man. We have Thor. I'm looking at him. Ant-Man, which is, it's quite interesting to read these old comics, and you can kind of see the American mythology, and you can see the collective unconscious and what the current anxieties were. There's this real preoccupation with radioactivity, radiation poisoning. All of these superheroes get their abilities from radiation, essentially. There's this looming threat, the atom bomb, gamma rays, that hovers over quite significantly over these comics. And if you look at like the Hulk, the Incredible Hulk, he got caught in a blast, an atom bomb detonation. If you look at where the powers of these superheroes come from, I think it really does attest to a strong anxiety about being destroyed and wiped out. And I think it's a way of a culture handling that anxiety. If we're talking about artists not primarily working in Marvel and DC, my favourite comic book artist who I just absolutely adore, his really unique, idiosyncratic drawing style and his stories. He has done work for Marvel and DC, but I absolutely adore Jeff Lemire. I've read most of what he's put out. This one here is called Trillium. I love the artwork. He's got loads of great comics. If you're looking to deep dive into a specific creator, I would highly recommend Jeff Lemire. And I've got some of my old mangas here. Actually, I've got tons of these. We should do a dedicated video at some point, because this is just a couple I've got to hand. We've got Ashita no Jo, which is pretty cool. It's pretty old school. A more contemporary manga, Zure Zure Children, which I read when it first came out in Japan, and I found that to be hilarious. I've picked up this one recently, but I haven't read this one yet. Yeah, and to answer your question, there is a lot of joy and insight, and there are a lot of rewards from reading comic books. And it's unfortunate that they've been disparaged, but I think in recent years, people are coming around to the fact that the comic book or the graphic novel as a medium can deliver some really profound and poignant and pressing ideas. I also think it's very much its own thing, with its own tradition, its own cast of great artists and writers. So yeah, that's cool. That's cool to know that you get a lot of enjoyment out of comic books. Me too. Okay, next question from Michael, who says, "You've mentioned briefly about liking jazz. Any particular favourites? Is there a jazz album you can read along to? Alternatively, is there a jazz record you adore that makes awful background music to a good reading session? Great question. Yeah, I love jazz. My favourite jazz album, it's always so hard to choose, but I'll show it to you. It's this one, Sketches of Spain by Miles Davis. Do yourself a favour, get some good headphones and listen to this in a single sitting all the way through. It's an absolutely sublime and blissful experience. Sketches of Spain, easily, hands down, my favourite. I'm a big fan of Thelonious Monk. I recently picked up his Palo Alto. I also did a review of this as well. Big fan of Monk, big fan of Miles Davis, the biggies essentially. It was John Coltrane who got me into jazz during my teenage years. I fell in love with a love supreme, and I still listen to it endlessly. Whether you could put such records on in the background whilst reading, I don't think you can. There certainly are works that you can listen to running in the background, but these albums need one's undivided attention as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to listening to music or having music on in the background whilst reading, I typically would favour classical music. I'll typically put Classic FM or something on and listen to it at a low level and make sure that I haven't picked something that's violent or will distract from what I'm reading. Okay, I'm going to try and go a little bit rapid fire because I'm aware that the video's going on quite long and you can kind of hear it in my voice, but I appreciate all of you. I appreciate all of the questions you've put to me. The next question is from Kieran of KD Books. First physical album you bought with your own money? Great question. I believe I bought 3. LA Woman by The Doors, Nick Drake's Pink Moon, and Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones. Great question, so thank you very much, and there are most certainly not any embarrassing answers that I've glided over there. Next question from Shiva. Have you ever thought about starting a podcast? Maybe someday. Canton asks, what makes a great writer great? I would say inexhaustible prose or poetry, addressing the themes of the human condition that endure across time, plugging into the human spirit under duress, the human spirit when swept up in joy, all of the strong emotions. If we had to choose just 2 words, I would say resonance and inexhaustibility. Next question is from Michael. Favourite manga? Yotsubato. Also probably Vagabond or Berserk as well, they're both really good. Slam Dunk, maybe, Slam Dunk. Also, what is your favourite guidebook for poetry? Stephen Fry, The Ode Less Travelled, one of my favourite books of all time. Samuel asks, you've done a video on Harold Bloom, do you have any opinions on his student Camille Paglia? No, I don't know who that is. I'll find out. Sean asks, hi Ben, I would love for you to do Zola's work and the tale of Genji. I also have an idea about you doing book recommendations for your child, perhaps a children's classics you get from the bookshop to show. I'm actually working on addressing children's literature in a really significant way, and I'm really excited about it. So if you're into children's literature, we've got some good stuff on the horizon, absolutely. Zola, I'm making my way through his work. I did read him a very long time ago, but I'm very much coming to him with fresh eyes. So we'll probably do something on Zola at some time. The Tale of Genji, yeah, it's a big one. We'll probably do that at some point as well. Next question. I've seen vinyls in the background of some of your videos. What are some of your favourite jazz records? Sketches of Spain, to be honest. Anything from Miles Davis, anything from John Coltrane, anything from Thelonious Monk, anything from Charlie Parker, anything from Charles Mingus. Pretty standard choices on my end, I'm aware of that, but those are the artists that I enjoy a lot. Kevin asks, how do I get involved with my own culture's literature? I am Ojibwe, Native American. How can I become a scholar of my own culture's literature, just like you are an English scholar of literature? A great question. There was a lady not too long ago who did a TED talk on the fact that she was trying to read a book from every single culture in the world, and an issue that she brushed up against, a challenge that she had to overcome, was the fact that there are many cultures that have an oral tradition. And to be honest, I would say that most cultures have an oral tradition. That's a real difficulty in trying to gather together the mythology, the narratives, the stories that a certain culture might like to tell if there aren't extensive records collated in one place. First thing I would recommend is to approach it with a bird's eye view at first. Try to get as many ducks in a row all lined up that you can. Put together a schedule for yourself and start learning. Hit the books, immerse yourself and read voraciously for years. And if you keep reading voraciously for years through a certain topic, it actually doesn't take that long, relatively speaking, before you become an expert on that topic. If you dedicate 3 years to learning about Ojibwe culture and heritage and language, literature, stories, mythology, all of that, if you dedicate just a handful of years, by the end of those years, if you do something small towards your goal each and every day, you will become an expert, a world expert on the culture. And then your challenge would be getting your message out there, trying to craft a compelling and persuasive way of disseminating the knowledge and getting people excited and introducing it to newcomers and those who have that same shared heritage alike. So get inspired, get yourself fired up, and then commit yourself to the hard work over the long term with the extensive reading. Relish the challenge, get yourself feeling optimistic, and start hitting the books and start noting down your thoughts. Journal, write around them, do marginalia, all of that, and start talking about what you're reading with other people. That's the most important part, because as you're talking to other people, you'll be able to see when people tune in, when they tune out, what piques someone's curiosity, where they ask questions, where there might be a gap in their knowledge, and then you can fill it. So start sharing your love of your culture with other people, and understand that though it might be difficult, there most certainly will be people who are very interested in what you have to share with them. So I wish you all the very best. I think that's a really applaudable aim to go after. So nice one, and do please keep me updated with how that's going for you. Next question. 3 most important books one should have read in their life. Oh, just 3. Whatever the main canonical religious text of your culture is, the complete works of Shakespeare, and that's really hard. Proust. Or Aristotle. Next question from Kim. Do you ever read fantasy or science fiction? If so, what are your favourites? Yes, absolutely. That was my footing into the world of books. I was raised on fantasy and science fiction, and I've always had a real soft spot for it, and the horror genre as well, which is a sort of subsidiary, isn't it? At the moment, I'm revisiting Ursula K. Le Guin's body of work, The Left Hand of Darkness, for example. Really, really good stuff. So that would be my first recommendation. And we actually have a fantasy and science fiction video specific to that genre coming out very soon. Next question. Have you ever read any Arabic literature, and what is your opinion on it? Yeah, actually, we spoke about this extensively in the most recent episode of Coffee with Hardcore Literature at the book club. I have recently started learning Arabic script. I've been reading the Quran, and I've been really impressed with the poignance of it, but I've also felt like the thing that's lacking is a knowledge of the language itself. The thing is, poetry doesn't hold up in translation very well, and if you read, for example, the King James Version of the Bible or the Geneva Bible in the original, then you're being treated to some of the most powerful and persuasive literature of all time. But reading it in translation, maybe not. So I was really impressed with what I was reading with the Quran and started to learn a little bit of Arabic script. So yes, absolutely, there's a whole world of Arabic literature that I hope someday will open up to me. And another question, Dickens or Tolstoy? And Dostoyevsky or Tolstoy? Who do you prefer? Who do I prefer? I prefer Charles Dickens, but that's because I can read the original language. What I would say is there's not a lot in it. It's very, very close between Dickens and Tolstoy. Dostoyevsky or Tolstoy? Personally, Tolstoy. But I understand why people might champion Dostoyevsky above Tolstoy, but for me it's Tolstoy. And I think we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. I'm very sorry if I haven't got to your question. There were so many of them. I put the call out on a little video that was going to self-destruct in about an hour, and we got so many questions come in. So I'd be happy to do a part 2 or roll these questions forward and address them in another capacity. I wish I could answer them all. There's been some really great ones, and I've really enjoyed this show. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for reading the great books with me, and thank you very much for getting us to 10k on the YouTube channel. I appreciate you all, and a special thank you to all of the lovely members at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, without whose support these videos would not be possible. Your patronage at the Hardcore Literature Book Club directly supports this content, these videos, the podcasts, and the lectures on the great books. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart, and have a lovely day everybody. Happy reading, and bye bye for now.